At CES, we were warmed up by AMD about the Ryzen 9 9900X3D and 9950X3D. Basically, bigger, badder versions of the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, which is the king of gaming processors at the moment. Obviously, the Ryzen 9 versions, dual dies, so either 12 or 16 cores, and you get 3D cache on one of those two core complexes. They promise to be a good all-round processor, loads of grunt, and also loads of gaming performance. In a recent presentation, AMD went even further. The Ryzen 9 9900X3D is the perfect processor for elite gamers, and also the perfect processor for elite creators. And they compare the 9900X3D against both the 7900X3D, i.e. the Zen 4 part, and also the Intel Core Ultra 9 285K. But things take a bit of a turn when you compare the two new processors against each other. The curve of the graph for the 9950X3D is a lovely upward slope. By contrast, the 9900X3D, it's a bit of a jaggedy mess. What on earth is going on here? And clearly, to find an answer, we need to look at the 9900X3D. And we just happen to have one here. So let's get on with the review. The basic specification of the Ryzen 9 9900X3D, we have 12 cores and 24 threads. Maximum boost speed is 5.5 GHz, which is slightly slower than the 9950X3D. In practice, we found the 9900X3D ran at a sustained 5.5 GHz in single core workload, where the 9950X3D runs at 5.7 GHz. Both processors have a sustained multi-core clock speed of 4.8 to 5.0 GHz, depending on the workload. We see the 9900X3D has 140 megabytes of cache thanks to the slab of 3D V cache and a nominal TDP of 120 watts. By contrast, the 9950X3D has a TDP of 170 watts, which is a significant difference between the specifications, considering the clock speeds look very similar. The second gen AMD 3D V cache lies at the heart of this processor. We covered this in our review of the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, the neat feature being that this 3D V cache goes under the chiplet rather than on top, and as a consequence it has no penalty for thermals or for clock speeds. And with that understanding, let's look again at some of those AMD charts that I briefly flashed on the screen earlier. We can see the horizontal grey line is the Ryzen 9 7900X3D, that's the 12 core Zen 4 part, and that's normalized to 100%. We can see the lighter gold line which curves up is the Ryzen 9 9950X3D, the Zen 5 16 core 3D. So at the extreme left, when we're looking at Assassin's Creed Mirage, it matches the 7900X3D, and on the extreme right, Metro Exodus, it's about 40% faster. And then we have the darker gold line, that's the Ryzen 9 9900X3D, so the 12 core Zen 5 3D. At the left hand side, Assassin's Creed Mirage, it matches the other two processors, but as you go across the chart you can see that the win over the Zen 4 part varies. More interestingly, there's a big gap at times between the 9900X3D and the 9950X3D, and you would think the explanation is that when you're gaming on the core complex that has 3D V cache, that the 9950X3D is essentially a Ryzen 7 with 3D cache, while the 9900X3D is essentially a Ryzen 5 with 3D V cache. We're looking at the difference between 6 and 8 cores. You can see that controlling the behavior of the processor is very important, and AMD's chipset software plays a very large part in that equation. With the Zen 4 Ryzen 9 3D processors, we had to muck around with game bars and all sorts of other stuff. AMD has worked on their chipset drivers, and we can now rely on the software to do the job on our behalf, which is just how it should be. They've updated their provisioning packages service and also their 3D V-Cache performance optimizer. A new aspect of this driver package is the AMD Application Compatibility Database. As they say, this refers to specific game titles and we can think of it as a whitelist. And as a result, we wouldn't be surprised to see these games performing well in benchmark tests. That's the theory, and now it's time to look at the processor in practice and see how it behaves in the real world. And this is my array of testing hardware. We have an MSI MPG X870E carbon Wi-Fi motherboard, Power supply. Seasonic Focus Gold ATX 3.1. That's a GX 1000 watts, so gold and 1000 watts. Our memory, G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo. Neo means it has an AMD Expo profile and it's rated at DDR5 6000. We could go up to 6400 with AMD quite safely, but I've been using 6000 on Zen 5 quite successfully, and until I'm ready to make the jump to 8000, I'm probably going to stick with that 6000. Graphics card. MSI RTX 4090 Ventus 3X, and my CPU cooler is this Fantex Glacier 1 360mm AIO, and it uses D30 fans, which are thicker than the standard 25mm units. And under this heatsink we have my SSD, which is a Crucial T700. That's a PCI Express Gen 5 M.2. And with the PC running, we can look in the BIOS and everything looks entirely conventional. I leave everything on auto with the exception of the fan curves, and I make sure that I set Expo for the memory. Before we get into our testing charts, let's have a quick look at the latency between the various cores in this processor. There are two heat maps here. On the left hand side we have the 99X 3D, on the right hand side the 99X. And essentially they're identical. The addition of the 3D cache appears to have absolutely no impact on the latency whatsoever. And with that piece of housekeeping out of the way, we move on to the charts. We're starting with Cinebench 2024 single core, and we've got a bit of color coding going on. Most of the bars are in yellow. The two new processors, the Ryzen 9 9950X3D and 9900X3D, are both in blue. And then we have 5 red bars for AMD processors of interest. In this chart you can see those red bars are the 9950X, the 9900X, the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, i.e. the Zen 5 Ryzen 7 3D part, the Ryzen 9 7950X3D, so the Zen 4 16 core 3D part, and the Ryzen 9 7950X, Zen 4 16 cores no 3D. As we can see, the 9950X3D does very well, while the 9900X3D is in the middle of the chart. Cinebench 2024 multi-core. Right at the top of the chart is the 9950X3D, in the middle of the chart is the 9900X3D. Geekbench 6 multi-core. The Ryzen 9 9900X3D moves up the chart, and it sits exactly between the Core i9 14900K and the Core i7 14700K. Geekbench 6 single core. Again, the Ryzen 9 9900X3D does well. It's now 5th in the chart. Right up at the top of the chart we have the Ryzen 9 9950X3D. And let's see how this works in terms of cost. We're working on the basis that the Ryzen 9 9900X3D is going to cost a penny under £600 including VAT here in the UK, while the Ryzen 9 9950X3D will cost a penny under £700 including VAT. The curious thing is that with current pricing, that means the Ryzen 9 9950X3D is £100 more than its non-3D part, whereas at the moment you could buy the Ryzen 9 9900X without 3D cache really cheap. This means the addition of the 3D cache in the Ryzen 9 9900X3D adds a huge £200 to the cost. And when we take the Cinebench 2024 multi-core score for each of these processors and divide by the retail price, at the top of the chart we'll have the Intel Core i5, Core i7, Core Ultra 5, Core Ultra 7, and then we move on to the mid-range parts from AMD. There's a bit of a mixture going on here with Zen 4 and Zen 5 parts, and then in the middle of the chart we come across the Core i9 14900K practically in a dead heat with the Ryzen 5 9600X. And right towards the bottom of the chart we come across the 3D parts. The extra cache really makes those parts expensive. We see the Zen 4 16 core Ryzen 9 7950X just above, in value terms, the Ryzen 9 9950X3D, which in turn is quite a leap ahead of the Ryzen 9 9900X3D. The part that offers the poorest value for money in Cinebench is the king of gaming, the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. And let's look at power consumption. This is nice and easy. Less power is better. The processors that draw the most power, Intel Core i7 and Intel Core i9. And then as we move up the chart, we can see at 222 watts we have the Ryzen 9 7950X. That's the Zen 4 part. We go up further, we can see the Ryzen 9 9950X and the 9950X3D require 200 watts. Both the Ryzen 9 9900X and 9900X 3D require 162 watts. And let's try the Cinebench 2024 maths again, this time taking the multi-core score and dividing by the CPU power draw in watts. The most efficient processor by a significant margin is the Zen 4 Ryzen 9 7950X 3D. The quality of that silicon is absolutely remarkable. A couple of steps down from that we have the two new parts from AMD, the Zen 5's 9950X 3D and 9900X 3D. This indicates the parts that have 3D cache are higher quality silicon than the mainstream processors. As we head down the chart we move through the mainstream AMDs, through Intel Core Ultra 200S, and at the very bottom of the chart we have Intel Raptor Lake. In 7-zip version 24, the Ryzen 9 9900X 3D does well, and it's a few places ahead of the non-3D Ryzen 9 9900X. Similar story with the 16-core part. Right at the top of the chart, the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. The regular 9950X is a few places below that. AIDA 64 memory bandwidth. This is primarily a test of the memory itself rather than the processors. So we see Intel Core Ultra 200S at the top of the chart, followed by 14th gen Raptor Lake. After that we have AMD Ryzen 9 parts, and bottom of the chart we have the single CCD AMD parts. 3D Mark Time Spy is a synthetic game test and it shows some very peculiar results. Raptor Lake at the top, followed by Core Ultra 200S, and then the first AMD part is the Ryzen 9 9900X 3D, closely followed by the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. Cast your eyes down the chart and you tell me whether this makes any sense to you. I cannot make head or tail of this. I've got no problem with Intel at the top of the chart, but the order of the AMD parts is just peculiar. Far Cry 6 at 1080p on Ultra preset. Top of the chart it's the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, very closely followed by the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D, which is clearly acting basically as a Ryzen 7 with 3D V-cache. It's impressive the Ryzen 9 9900X 3D is in third place. There is some separation, but it performs very well. Far Cry 6 at 1440p, again on Ultra preset. Top of the chart again, Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, and again it's the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D in second place, and this time the Ryzen 9 9900X 3D in third place is very closely behind. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora at 1080p on Ultra preset. Top of the chart it's the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, followed by the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. In third place it's the Ryzen 9 9900X 3D. There's a theme developing here. It has to be said that in this game at this resolution the scores are incredibly close together. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora at 1440p on Ultra. Again top of the chart by a clear margin, Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, and then in second and third places Ryzen 9 9950X 3D and 9900X 3D. Assassin's Creed Mirage at 1080p on ultra high preset. Top of the chart it's the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D, closely followed by the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. Did not expect that. A few places below and about 10 FPS behind we have the Ryzen 9 9900X 3D. Assassin's Creed Mirage at 1440p. The surprise here is that the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D, i.e. the Zen 4 part, sneaks into third place, and then in fourth, Ryzen 9 9900X 3D. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080. It's the same story, the two Ryzen 7 3Ds, Zen 5 and Zen 4 at the top, and then the two Zen 5 Ryzen 9 3Ds behind those. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440. Top of the chart, it's the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. Second place, Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. Third and fourth places, the two new Ryzen 9 3Ds. Total War Pharaoh at 1080p. Top of the chart it's the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. Then we have the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. Then the Ryzen 9 7950X 3D. And then in fourth place Ryzen 9 9900X 3D. Total War Pharaoh at 1440p. It's the Ryzen 7 3D at the top, followed by the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. And then in third place Ryzen 9 9900X 3D. Before I get to my conclusions about this Ryzen 9 9900X 3D, Apart from the fact I've now said that model name a great many times, along with Ryzen 9 9950X 3D, Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, and I hope I've said them all correctly, but it really fries the brain. I wish to goodness someone at AMD would actually try reading out these model codes ad nauseam just to see how it feels. But let's push that to one side. That's my problem. From the point of view of this review, it's been awkward. AMD's embargo on these two Ryzen 9 3D processors is slightly tricky for me, because it forbids me to tell you in advance I have the processors, and also I cannot tell you I have an upcoming review. So you're learning about this review when it goes live. But it means I'm actually forbidden to speak to other reviewers to say, have you got one of these processors to review? Because that would break the embargo. Ordinarily, I'd know who's got them pretty much, because that wouldn't be secret. So in this instance, I don't know who has got which samples, but I get the impression that the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D has been sent to all the reviewers reviewing these new 3Ds, and the 9900X 3D has been sent to possibly nobody. Thing is, KitGuru bought this processor in time for this review. Obviously, we're under embargo, so we can't go early, and that's known to the retailer that sold it to us. I have the 9950X 3D as well, and I'll be doing a review of that separately. But the 9900X 3D caught my eye because the dollar pricing, which I'm quite sure is the same as the pound pricing, probably as the euro pricing, seems silly close to the 9950X 3D, 600 against 700. And of course, we've seen something very similar recently with graphics, the 9070 and 9070 XT. The pricing is very similar, but the performance is quite different. They are a tier apart. In this instance, it's a 12-core processor against a 16-core processor. So how can it be 6/7 of the price? Doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why I went out of my way to get my hands on one to benchmark it. And here's the thing. I think AMD has deliberately priced this processor too high and made it look like a bad deal. It is a bad deal in my view. But I think the reason they've done it, and this is speculation on my part, is to separate the Ryzen 9 9900X 3D from the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, which is, as I've said a few times, the king of gaming. At £480, that's an expensive processor, but it's really good for gamers. On the other hand, the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D falls down when you start doing serious grunt work like video editing, zipping and unzipping, stuff like that. It's okay, but it's not great. Whereas the Ryzen 9s are really good. But I cannot find a reason to suggest why you'd buy this 12-core 3D when you can buy the 16-core 9950X 3D for £100, dollars, euros more. The separation in pricing makes very little sense when you look at the two parts, the 9900X 3D, 9950X 3D. If you look at the product stack, you might get a slightly different picture. In that light, here are my pros and cons. The 9900X 3D has impressive gaming performance. It's actually better gaming performance than I expected. The AMD Chipset Drivers handle the 3D V-cache very well. I did no manual switching around of the cores, the core complexes. I just let the software handle it, and it did a good job. Low operating temperature, the ambient at the minute is 20 degrees, and it's 65 degrees operating temperature for this 12-core part. The 16-core 9950X 3D operates more like 70 degrees. 65 degrees with a 360 cooler running low and slow. Impressed by that. And finally, the 9900X 3D has the same clock speeds and power draw as the regular 9900X. In other words, the 3D V-cache doesn't affect the behavior of the processor in terms of thermals and power in the slightest. Cons, the negative points. The cost is too high and the value is poor. And secondly, the 3D cache doesn't help in day-to-day tasks. It does very slightly. 7-zip, there's some slight assistance, and I think Geekbench might have shown a little bit, but certainly not enough to consider buying this part for that alone. Clearly the 3D V-cache is for gaming, and if you're going to buy this processor for gaming, you do better to buy the Ryzen 7 3D or the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D. This just falls between those two processors and the pricing ruins it. However, AMD can change pricing, and if they choose to do that, it will perk me up and it will make this processor far more desirable. Overall, I'm going to say it's worth considering. The part itself is absolutely fine. It's the product stack and its position in that stack that gets a little bit weird, and then the pricing just puts the boot in, quite frankly. As hardware and as software, good. As a product, not so good. We're on TikTok, so go and check us out. And also on the web, we are kitguru.net.